Hello, everybody. This is my friend Dustin Steinhagen, and hi, Dustin.
Hi. It's a pleasure to be on your YouTube channel. Finally, I've been following your channel and your work for years. So
Thank you.
um
And you are now a doctor. You have a PhD in the subject of cybersecurity, and I was very surprised. It's a while back, isn't it? Is it? It's a couple of years that you first contacted me.
yeah,
And you said you wanted me to be on your dissertation committee, and I'm kind of, well, I don't have any academic qualifications, but you insisted. So I ended up being on your dissertation committee and had the tremendous privilege of seeing the work you were doing at first hand, which was bringing together, it's rather obvious that if you get into cybersecurity, if people understand the Machiavellian tactics of thought reform and you weld the two together, that you get something quite dangerous. Yet there is almost nobody in the field of cybersecurity who seems to be aware of this. So, having somebody who's an expert on propaganda, on thought reform, and this, I think, is going to become ever more significant. So, do you want to tell us what decided you to do this work in the first
sure.
place?
So yeah, yep. So like John mentioned, I got my doctorate degree from Dakota or the it was Dakota State University, so one of the top universities for cybersecurity. And my path to thought reform research and actually deciding to enter the cybersecurity field is quite unusual. So actually, there's a bit of a backstory to this, and
Yeah.
it kind of was all centered around the year 2018. So, I got my undergraduate degree from Cornell University, and the most important university course I ever took was in the spring of my senior year. So this was spring 2018. The course was called Computational Psychology. So
Mm.
the whole thesis of this course is that the brain is literally a computer and the mind is computation. So that's the whole course is covering examples and the theory behind explaining this. So, and that by itself would have been interesting, but 2018 was also a very interesting year for, or I should say, a quite devastating year for human exploitation.
Mm.
So, if your audience will recall, this is when the Cambridge Analytica scandal was breaking the news,
Mm.
um, and there was other stuff going on as well. So Cambridge Analytica was, and I should rewind and say, Cambridge Analytica is the most important privacy case study. So in the privacy field, we talk about like exploiting people's personal data and the abuse of people, protecting people from privacy harms. So Cambridge Analytica is kind of the main case study that we talk about, why privacy is important. Uh, in 2018 too, there was something else going on that was brought to my attention. It was the Elsagate scandal. So this was, and I'm not an expert on this, but I do remember learning about this at the time, and there was essentially pedophile propaganda being uploaded to YouTube
Right.
to break down children's minds. And it was a very disturbing incident or phenomenon that was happening. So I remember that piqued my attention, and then kind of to cap things off, also in 2018. So I actually tracked down this article because I had started getting interested in malicious influence, and uh, I learned about romance scams. So I
Mm.
guess to define this for everyone, a romance scam is when you pose as a suitor on a dating website, and then you trick someone into falling in love with you, and then you have some kind of cover story to extract money from them.
Mm.
So, and this particular story was quite gruesome, actually. So, this was a Gizmodo article from 2018. And the title says Catfish victim allegedly planned to kill mother to get money to pay scammer. So, uh, so yeah, quite terrible. And actually, I had a very unusual kind of response to that. I feel like most people, if they would hear about romance scams and stuff, they would say, "Oh, that's terrible." They would have a compassionate response,
Mm.
and then there will be a minority of people will say, it sucks to suck," or they'll have some kind of a kind of a they don't want to encounter the fact that they're actually vulnerable to influence as well. They'll
Mm.
they'll try to deny it. My response was actually like, "Wow, I'm vulnerable." Like I'm
Yeah.
like man, nobody told me about this. Like, how come I never learned about this in school? No one ever
Mm.
prepared me to face the reality that I'm vulnerable and could be hacked in this way, and that
Mm.
someone could convince me to kill my own parents, or that I could be recruited into a terrorist sect.
Mm.
So I was quite disturbed, actually.
Mm.
So I'd say I
And
had a
and
quite
and
a
if I can
yeah,
interject, that
sure.
that's a realization that most people don't have. I 40 years ago, I interviewed a guy who was on the Watchdog Committee, with the 14 people who ran Scientology and were directly under Hubbard's orders. And I had to do it in secret because he feared for his safety. And so over 2 evenings, we met in a diner and had these conversations. And he told me things that were just mind blowing about what Hubbard was telling them to do. You know, Hubbard had told them, for example, that the end of the world was coming. There was nothing he could do to stop it. They were the only people he could save. And this guy said, "So I left because if my mum and dad and my sister are going to die, then I'm going to die with them." Bless him. He was a teenager. He was 19. And at the end of the conversation, he looked at me triumphantly the second evening and he said, "You see, the great thing about this, John, is that we'll never be scammed again." And I looked at him and went, "No, no. The great thing is I know I'm gullible. And that makes you so much safer in the world if you are checking your own, credulity at all times." So,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. It's and maybe that's just part of my temperament is being more humble about my own vulnerability. But I really think a large part of this too was being immersed in the science of computational psychology
Mm,
at this time because it was just kind of serendipitous that I was being made aware of these human exploitation phenomena while learning about the brain literally being a computer.
mm,
So really, I had this epiphany, the brain isn't just a computer; it's a vulnerable computer that can be hacked.
mm.
And I know that's kind of language that Dr. Hassan uses in his work too, is mind hacking. And I really think that's appropriate. If the brain
Yeah.
literally is a computer, it literally is being hacked.
Mm,
We're literally vulnerable. And of course, in my dissertation, I explain a lot of the theory behind that and
mm.
use more formal language.
But again,
Um,
to interject, Ron Hubbard from the start in his first book in 1950 said the mind is a computer. And his whole hypothesis was how you're going to do something like that. Now, of course, the word computer at that time meant a calculator. So he had a
yeah,
number that was held down and got stuck in equations. But nonetheless, it's an essential doctrine in Scientology that you are dealing with a computer. And that means you can program, reprogram, deprogram, do that kind of thing. I must say, I am very hesitant about this comparison. That if we think of a computer as something that works in binary digits and that the human brain, as you know, because you've read Opening Our Minds, that as a computer, the human brain is way more complicated
well, there's
than
different
any
types
machine.
of computers.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
then,
And ours is a
yeah,
very sophisticated form of computer. Let's put it that way.
yeah, and the science here is very complicated. It
Mm,
kind of sounds almost dogmatic if I just say the brain is computer and leave it at that.
mm,
So the citation, if someone's interested, and the math gets pretty complex, but my undergraduate professor's work, it's called "Computing the Mind: How
mm.
the Mind Really Works." So that's the main citation that I would point
And
people to.
the name of your professor?
Dr. Shimon Edelman
Okay.
at Cornell University. So, and of course, and talk to any neuroscientist, and they'll use terms in their research papers like neural computation, and so this is something that's well known, at least in that field.
Yeah.
Uh,
Let
so
me just make one pause though. In the this year, for example, work that's been done on the locus coeruleus, which is the little blue dot around the tips of the ears at the back of your head, has shown that there are four stages of attention that are determined by this tiny little place. When we start getting into that and the relationship between that and the other 200 brain regions, the 3,300 kinds of neuron among the 80 to 90 billion neurons, let alone the 80 to 90 billion glial cells, we're in a level of complexity and interaction that I don't, it is not like a computer. It's beyond any of the computers, even the squid systems, the biocomputers that we've made. And I would also be hesitant about saying neuroscientists say this, therefore it's true. Look at the way that Daniel Kahneman's idea, who's not a neuroscientist, of thinking fast and thinking slow. People have just accepted that as a truth, as they did with id, ego, superego. These things don't exist. As Kahneman has said, it's a metaphor. He's not saying there are two brain systems. There are far more than two brain systems functioning at any given moment. So it's just so that people don't start doing a Hubbard on us and going, oh, they're saying that the mind's like a calculator, that we are dealing with something, but of course it's not spiritual, it's physical, it's actual, it's real. So
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And to be, to be humble and transparent, I'm not an expert in computational psychology. I took
mm,
one university course in it,
yeah.
which really opened my mind to
Mm,
the possibility of being vulnerable. And that's where I went down
yeah.
the path of research was in particular thought reform. But uh, so that was really the impetus behind the dissertation. So.
Mm,
And and it's very, very complex. And also, mind hackers don't need to have a complete understanding of how the brain works to hack people.
no,
So
they don't need any understanding. Looking, having analysed, I don't know how many hundred by now authoritarian groups over history, throughout time, they use the same methods, but they didn't necessarily acquire them by reading psychology textbooks or something like that. They just, I'm writing something about Madame Blavatsky and her interest in spiritualism at the moment. And because spiritualism starts when these two little girls find that they can crack their toe knuckles. And so they get their older sister, who's 20 years older than the Fox sisters, and they convince her that these are psychic rappings. These noises are answers to questions. And then they're mega celebrities. And eventually, within a year, somebody works out what they're just cracking their knuckles in their toes. This isn't spiritual rappings of any kind. But once you've caught hold of something like that, they were kids. They had no idea where this was going to go. 40 years later, one of the two sisters made a public demonstration showing this is how we do it. We make these really loud noises. And if you put something soft underneath their feet, they can't make the noises because they're using the floorboards to amplify the noise. Oh, it's the spirits talking to us, and then you got the Ouija board and all of this nonsense that comes out of it. Yes. So yeah, the people doing it, the charlatans doing it, and often they actually believe what they're doing. I think with Hubbard, there's a strong case which Yuval Noah has made that Hubbard had temporal lobe epilepsy. And so he believed these revelations that he'd have every 6 months that say, oh, right, now I know how to do it. Now I know how to cure cancer. Now I know how to raise people from the dead. What I was telling you 6 months ago isn't true anymore. And I think it depended, which day of the week it was, or whether there was an hour in the month as to how convicted he was of his opinions. But they, with him, he picked up pretty much every technique you can use to manipulate people. That there are probably about 30 basic techniques. He used them all. Many other leaders will only use, transcendental meditation just has two techniques. Scientology has 2,000, which come out of these 30 basic ways of getting somebody into their imagination and then controlling their perception, their interpretation of reality by telling them how it works. And as you say, that very much analogous to a computer. You're dealing with a computational system, if we call it that.
yeah, yeah, the brain is a machine that processes information. And in the social engineering course that I taught, I it's more of a metaphor. You can think of poisoning the information streams. So a
Mm,
person's constantly updating their understanding of reality
mm,
and kind of their sense of local statistics, right? Like the odds of something being true. If you poison the information that's getting into the brain, then you essentially poison the updates to the person's sense of reality, if you will. So that's milieu control from Lipton's eight criteria.
yes,
And
and
that's why we're all vulnerable too. If you can control a person's immediate context and the information they're receiving, the brain can't help but utilize that information. Um,
yeah,
you
and
know,
it's what Conway and Siegelman called information disease, which was my, in the 80s, was my entry into some attempt to understand what is happening to people. I don't fully agree with their hypothesis, but the idea of, which is now, it's moved over into the atheist community that religion is a virus. And it's like, yeah, and that's a metaphor, but it's an interesting metaphor. Why it's not a bacterium, I don't know, but there you go. But we do if there's any kind of perverted information, just as Hubbard said in Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health in 1950, if your information is wrong and you make your calculations based on wrong information, you'll come to wrong conclusions. And people who've been watching me over the last couple of weeks will know why I've got a Donald Trump book behind me in terms of, taking information in and coming to the wrong conclusions. That it is beyond my comprehension that anybody would vote for this man, given that he says he'll be a dictator on day one, and he's going to have a day of violence. He's going to clear out 15 to 20 million people. He's going to, his political opponents, the enemy within. I look at that and I go, so what is it in the way that people are passing this information that they're, seeking to understand that they're not getting? Is it like, and of course, that's been what's baffled me from the beginning when I left Scientology and I realized that Ron Hubbard was a liar. It was really simple. He'd give two versions of the same event that were in conflict with each other. So saying that 1965 he issues My Philosophy, handwritten, where he says he was crippled and blinded with physical injuries to hip and back. At the end of World War II, faced a non-existent future, abandoned by family and friends, all of this stuff. Whereas in a thing called Communication in Isness, which I think was 1957, he says in, July 25th, he was down, 1945, he was down in Hollywood and beat up 3 petty officers. And you go, well, the end of the war was August 14th. So somewhere between July 25th and August 14th, he was crippled and blinded. That's not really true because I've got his Navy records. I know he drove down from the hospital to go and perform black magic ceremonies at the end of the year. So he wasn't that crippled and blinded. But when I took that to other people and said, look, Scientology is the road to truth, and the road to truth must be trod with true steps, according to Aaron Hubbard. And he said, honesty is sanity. And I looked at that and went, I'm out of here. After 9 years, I'm out of here. Nobody that I talked with took the same view. Everybody had a justification, a way of rationalizing, intellectualizing this and making sense of it. So one woman I talked with who was had been a senior Scientologist said, well, it's obvious he had 2 bodies. I was like, well, yeah, why didn't I think of that?
Yeah,
Oh,
well, yeah, cognitive biases are powerful.
and
And yeah,
how?
I wanted a chance to show this. This is one of my favorite books. This is Christopher Wiley's memoir about Cambridge Analytica. And this has a tie-in with, Donald Trump they were mentioning earlier. So Cambridge Analytica was a psychological warfare firm who were doing research into, psychometrics, utilizing people's personal data to maliciously influence them, essentially to vote a certain way.
And you
And
have aggregate IQ is the other aspect of it, which we
yeah,
suffer from under Brexit. But it's Robert and Rebecca Mercer, isn't it, from the right wing in America, and people like Steve Bannon.
yeah, and actually, one thing I learned reading the memoir is that kind of the people behind Cambridge Analytica were manipulating elections in other countries before
Nelson
the 2020.
Mandela and Barack
Right.
Obama both used Cambridge Analytica, yeah.
Yeah,
Not to the extent that the Trump campaign did.
yeah, and well, and kind of tying this back to cognitive biases, Christopher Wiley mentions that because he was one, he was the main whistleblower for
Mm.
breaking the story on Cambridge Analytica. He mentioned that the human brain suffers from thousands of cognitive biases. That's something that he mentions in the book. I don't know if there's literally thousands, but there are many that have been documented and studied by cognitive scientists. It's I don't want to say it's impossible. It's very hard to resist, false conclusions, false perceptions, false memories, all these things that cognitive
Mm.
biases can they can make us act irrationally. So I guess one comment I would have about Donald Trump and Trump supporters is don't just assume that your mind is secure.
No.
Like it takes. I mean, you and I know as well as anyone else, we're both vulnerable to terrorist recruitment, for example, or falling for scams. Uh, we're extremely vulnerable. I don't want to speak for you, but I mean, I think we would both agree to that.
Robert,
And
Robert Cialdini, in writing Influence, which is a must read, an absolute must read for everybody alive, starts by saying the reason he started his research into influence is because he's a patsy. He falls for everything. And,
yeah,
you know, I it as we both know, by accepting, by having a degree of humility about our vulnerability, it actually does make us less vulnerable. And there are ways of being less vulnerable. There are ways of understanding how propaganda works. And of course, that's how you encounter my work through opening our minds, where I'm kind of going, this is everywhere. This is in our education system. This is in our political system. It's in our religions that we are, people are scamming themselves and then scamming others, or they're just scamming others in some cases. They know very well what they're about.
Yeah, and actually, I think this would be a good time to kind of transition to talking about the dissertation study,
Mm,
because humility was something that I measured quantitatively. So, kind of just to give a little bit of background on kind of the main idea of the dissertation was to quiz everyday people about thought reform and essentially give them a score. So
mm,
it was a knowledge assessment, and there was 47 questions on psychologically manipulative groups, more commonly known as cults, and thought reform. So I'll be going over some of the some of my favorite questions that I asked
mm,
in the survey, and some of the main statistical findings as well. So so just kind of like the some of the overall survey statistics here. The sample size was 147, so not outstanding, but good enough for certain quantitative measures. There was 47 questions on the test, so that was the maximum score that a person could get.
mm.
And the score range of the respondents was between one, so that there was a respondent who got a single point correct, and the maximum score was 46 out of 47.
Mm.
And kind of talking about the score of 1 out of 47,
And
there
this
was
is people's understanding that they are vulnerable or not. And so they score high if they appreciate their vulnerability, and they
well
score low if they don't. Yeah.
well there was a correlation. Well, it's actually a little bit more complicated than that.
Yeah.
In the sample of 147, two people were what I would call thought reform deniers. So to kind of define that formally, these were the people that selected answers to the questions where, like, for example, like one of the distractors on a question would be like psychological manipulation doesn't exist. And then those people would consistently select that,
Mm.
those types of answers. So they scored exceedingly low on the test. The only reason why I had distractors that said, psychological manipulation doesn't exist is because I read the literature, and the literature suggested that there are people out there that say, or believe that, thought reform and brainwashing are just myths,
Mm.
that they don't exist at all. Otherwise, I wouldn't have thought even to include those, but I want to make sure those people can answer the knowledge assessment in good faith. But these were the minority, right? This was only two people out of 147. Talking about humility and in the actual thing, there was an actual question for humility. So the question asked people whether they believed they could be lured into a psychologically manipulative group or relationship. And the possible two answers were yes, it is possible, or no, it is not possible. So 2/3 of people said it was possible. I should probably,
Mm.
this is pretty important. This was South Dakotan adults,
Mm.
so we probably should mention that first.
Yeah.
This was the entire state population of South Dakota. So that's the population I studied. So 2/3 of South Dakota adults said that it was possible that they could be lured
Mm.
into a psychologically manipulative group or relationship, and then 31% said it was not possible. So these are the people that lacked that humility
Mm.
of believing themselves vulnerable.
Mm.
So what gets even more interesting is seeing if there's a correlation between being humble and your test score on this
Mm.
assessment. So it turns out that there was a positive correlation between people who selected yes, it is possible. So the people who were humble and their test scores. So it was a low to moderate positive correlation. And this is interesting because we kind of theorized this in the thought reform literature, and by we I mean collectively, thought reform experts have kind of
Mm.
suggested that if you're humble, you'll be more protected.
Mm.
As we know from social psychology, in general, the more you know about how influence and manipulation work, the more protected you'll be.
Yeah.
The more prepared you'll be to resist such attempts. So to see that there is a positive correlation between the humility and the test scores suggests that there is some veracity to this theory. So this is the first, to the best of my knowledge, specifically for
It's the
the thought
first
reform,
time,
the
first
first
time
time,
anybody's done it.
the first time that any
Mm.
scholar has
Mm.
demonstrated a quantitative relationship
Mm.
here.
Yeah.
So of
Which,
course,
which is,
yeah,
really want to underline that it was a very significant achievement. It's something I've and in others in the field, like Margaret Singer, for example, and Janjo Lelic, Steve Hassan, we've hypothesized this for decades. So, and it is one of the bizarre things. There are so many people studying in universities and desperate to find some topic to mine and kind of going, come over here. I've got 100 PhDs that you could do. There's so much that we haven't
Thousands
done.
of thousands of research studies that should have been done decades ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, like it's so strange that I mean, just this research study looking into education, measuring quantitatively education awareness about thought reform. How come this wasn't done in any of the subfields of psychology? Why did it take a cybersecurity student to do this?
Well, we came up to that, didn't we, with the psychologist who was on your dissertation panel saying, "Oh, this should probably have been in my area." At one point while we were talking, it's like, "Yeah,
Hmm.
please do. Come and see me, and we'll."
Yeah, and I don't. It's a very thought reform is a very interdisciplinary subject, so I don't think it belongs to just one area or one discipline. I
No,
think there's a lot of we can get a lot of fruits from expanding the number of disciplines that look at this.
I couldn't agree more.
So
Yeah, absolutely, and right across the board in the humanities as well as the sciences, looking at the way influence has occurred and does occur. And it's endlessly fascinating. As I say, I'm writing about Madame Blavatsky, but I'm writing about Madame Blavatsky because of Aryan race theory. That when you trace down what it was that drove Himmler, who was the most powerful man in the German Reich after Hitler, and the guy that was actually running things while Hitler read the newspaper and picked his nose, this Aryan race theory, this absolute nonsense that there is some pure breed of, white people, you know, when you get into it, you can find that it comes from Madame Blavatsky in 1888. She puts forward this idea of seven races, and the Aryans fell from the heavens encased in ice 2 million years ago. Um, yeah, it's all true. And you're going, well, this was just a nutty woman actually from Ukraine. She's called Russian, but it's just this crazy woman, and it becomes a Holocaust. It turns into, speaking of cognitive biases, this idea that therefore the Jews, and I think more than 100,000 Jews fought in World War One on the German side, but they're the people that, it's like one of the books I'm reading about, what's his name, Pelly, William Dudley Pelly, who was the leader of the Silver Shirts, the fascist, one of the many fascist movements in the US. That he's, the guy writing about him says it's really strange. You got all of these immigrant Jews, leading up to 1900 and beyond. About 4 million people came into the US, and they are a lesser people, and yet somehow they're running the government of the world. It's like, okay, you can have it one way or the other, really. But so you get a crazy idea, and it is like an infection that, with Brexit here, that the Dominic Cummings came up with this "take back control," this slogan. And the first time I saw it, I went, that is just the most brilliant slogan, because it's nothing to do with Brexit. It's like your life, or "make America great again." It's like America is great. It's greater now than it's ever been, because of all of the bloody awful things that history has to say. So, but you tell people that, and they have the golden age syndrome, where, which Churchill, of course, used in World War II, that this wonderful, beautiful country that we're going to return to. And you sell that. And we take it. We like that idea of, I'm going to be able to take back control. Just as soon as we leave the European Union, I'll have control. It's like, not really. We've got chaos as a consequence, but there you go.
So, returning to the
Yeah.
survey, so another thing that I investigated was seeing if there was correlations between demographic variables and people's knowledge about thought reform. So, I looked at educational attainment, a person's age, biological sex, subjective social status, which this was asking someone whether they self-identify as poor, working class, middle class, or affluent. It's similar to socioeconomic status, but I think it's actually I preferred it because it was, some people just looking at a person's income might not be the full story of,
No.
if a person has a lot of assets. So I thought it would be better. And then race and ethnicity. So there was no statistically significant correlations following a multiple regression
Mm.
analysis
Which is
to see.
fascinating. Yeah.
And now part of this might have just been the low sample size. So there's a caveat there,
Mm.
but if there was like a very strong correlation, it probably would have showed up
Mm.
um, at least partially. So but again, this is the very first study of its kind that's looking
Yeah.
at thought reform literacy and like a general geographically defined population. The previous literature in this area was really just confined to like university classrooms. So it would be interesting to see, doing this in the other 50 or the other 49 states, and then other countries as well to see
Mm.
if there are any correlations in other populations. But this was the initial finding that demographic variables did not play a role
Mm.
in somewhat in there's no patterns that I detected in terms of a person's knowledge about thought reform and cults.
Mm.
So I have kind of like a list of some of my favorite questions from the test. I think there's not enough time to cover all 47 questions, but I do want to mention that I paid the open access fee at ProQuest Dissertations and Theses. So my dissertation is open access to everyone, so you can get a free copy if you want to look at the full statistics and graphs. But I'll just be going over kind of my favorites.
Mm.
So
Spike will put a list in the description below.
yeah, so the there was different areas of thought reform literacy to look at, and the first one was seeing people's familiarity with synonyms for thought reform. So this was like measuring the proportion of people who had heard of, brainwashing, psychological abuse, psychological manipulation, etc. So the most recognized term was brainwashing with 98% of the
Mm.
sample. And the other two that were quite recognized were psychological abuse and psychological manipulation with 94% and 91% recognition, respectively. So I think these are probably the preferred terms just for communicating with lay people.
Yeah.
Because yeah,
I've long used the term manipulation, which 100% of people recognize probably. And
yeah,
with brainwashing, as you say, that there's a problem because in the social sciences, there are quite a lot of academics who oppose the very concept of brainwashing and influence, particularly in the field of sociology. And
yeah,
they're kind of, well, there's some sort of idea that what we're talking about is zombification, that people come completely under control. And that's not my experience. I don't tend to use the word brainwashing because I think as a specialist term coming from the Chinese Sinao, and they should have the right to call it what they want to call it. They call it brainwashing. But it's the re-education process that is concerned with actually does have physical violence involved with it, sleep deprivation, all sorts of things. Whereas, say, exploitative persuasion, Margaret Singer's term of art, you don't, we've got this complexity at the moment in this country since 2015. We have what's called a Coercive Control Act. And I sort of hesitate and go, why is the word coercive in there? Because coercion means force, intimidation, or threat. And those are the three things it isn't. We're talking about a way of controlling people without forcing them physically, without intimidating them, without threatening them. So, you know, um,
yeah, it's predominantly about deception.
yeah, Evan
So,
Stark
so
hit on the wrong term, and it's now become the term in the same way that brainwashing, because of this, the terrible the camps in China in the late 40s, early 50s, that it's stuck. But if it's the term that people recognize, it's the term that people recognize. So we have to be aware of that and communicate with people at the level of their interpretation, how they will interpret what we're saying.
yeah, and kind of to expand on that, the least recognized term was thought reform, which
Yeah.
this is, I mean, different scholars will have different opinions, of course, but I mean, this is my preferred term, which
Mm,
is why it was in the title of the dissertation,
mm,
for historical reasons. And it was 46% of the sample recognized the term, and then 46% didn't, and
mm,
then the remainder was non-response. So that was the term that performed the least, but it's or one of the most accurate terms. So
mm.
I guess a
Yeah.
lesson for this, for a pragmatic lesson for this, lead with the term psychological abuse or psychological manipulation. And there's some other terms, but I'm going to continue on to some of the other questions.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So the next one was familiarity with what I called thought reform tragedies. So these were kind of the classic case studies in the cultic studies fields. This would be the Manson family murders, Jonestown, Waco,
And I mean,
Heaven's Gate,
I
etc.
was fascinated because, as you know, one of the things I have on the stove at the moment is a book about Charles Manson and his incredible involvement with Scientology, which has been overlooked in the hundreds of pieces that have been written and filmed about him. Largely because of a campaign by Scientology to stop people from realizing that this is what happened. But I've got the internal Scientology documents. There is no doubt. But I was fascinated. It was a very high score for Manson. It was like, well,
Yeah, it was actually the most recognized
mm.
tragedy that I should mention there was 8 tragedies. So I'll just list them all right now.
But on that point with Manson, people recognize that this was, you know, the best known case of psychological manipulation. Now sit anybody down and ask them what he did to manipulate these people. And when
Right,
you
and yeah,
get
and
they've
this was
no
just
idea. When you come to the
yeah.
case itself, Bugliosi, the prosecutor who wrote Helter Skelter, the biggest selling crime book of all time, or co-wrote it, the guy called Kurt Gentry, that in court he argued right to the end that Manson's followers were robots. That's the word he used. And then at the end, he said, but I want them to go to prison as well. And you're kind of going, so you got it both ways. He completely controlled them, but they have to suffer the consequences as if the acts had been done under their own volition, which I think is monstrously unfair. But that point of, yeah, we know that Manson was controlling people. How did he do it? Oh, he used LSD. Yes. And then what did he do? And people are blithely unaware, which I would like to correct, but I need a big publisher if there's one watching, you know, because I don't want to publish this thing, sell 500 copies and have somebody else steal my material. So if any big publishers watching, you know, somebody at HarperCollins is out there, then I'd like some money, please.
Yeah, and kind of to expand on your point, this was a very kind of surface level investigation of people's familiarity
Of
with thought
course, yeah.
reform. I mean, well, at least this group of questions, like talking about the tragedies, some of the questions I will be talking about dig a little bit deeper actually to see what people's actual understanding is.
Mm,
But yeah, the Manson family murders was, as you alluded to, the most recognized tragedy with 97%
mm,
recognition. So some other ones that a lot of people recognize, Jonestown was 84%, Waco slash David Koresh or the Branch Davidians 92%. Native American genocide, I included that because that's been in the news recently, and that had a special tie-in with the South Dakotan population. We have a large Native population
yeah.
in South Dakota, so there was 92% people had heard of Native American genocide or the boarding school era.
Mm,
And then some ones and then Patty Hearst was 76%. So some of the least recognized ones were actually Aum Shinrikyo. So only 31% said that they had recognized it. Now, that was the only international incident. I
mm,
know Jonestown had an international element to it, but that was
yeah.
predominantly an American tragedy. So Aum Shinrikyo, not a surprise there, because that was in Japan. Now, the Heaven's Gate incident was 44% people recognized and 56% didn't.
Mm.
So I was actually quite shocked on that one because
It is, isn't it? Shocking
yeah.
because it is an all-American tragedy.
Hmm. Yeah, and I mean that made huge headlines. So
Mm.
so yeah, quite interesting. And then 31% of people had never heard of MK Ultra, but actually I was impressed that 69% had heard of it.
Yes.
So yeah. Okay, so the next question, and now most of these other questions kind of focus more on kind of what I was alluding to earlier with they're kind of they go a little bit deeper than the surface level. So this question was about asking respondents which components of the mind can be influenced or changed by other people. So the way this was built was that it aggregated or so like the different distractors. So the person could respond just beliefs and behaviors or beliefs, behaviors, and thoughts and emotions. So that
Mm.
would be the bite components from
Yeah.
Dr. Aston's model. The third distractor was beliefs, behaviors, thoughts, emotions, memories, and use of language. And then the fourth one was all those previous six, and then identity and personality.
Mm.
So 59% answered correctly that all 8 of the components that I had just mentioned could be influenced or changed by other people. So I was actually very impressed with this question. I
Mm.
thought this would be one of the hardest ones on the entire test, but the majority of people got it correct, that even a person's core identity and personality can be changed
Yeah.
in through influence. So so yeah, very so very impressed with the South Dakotan adults. This next one, I was also very impressed. So this question asked about, it was a concise summary of how psychological manipulation works. So the correct answer was that psychological manipulation is a deceptive series of changes. So you take someone through a series of changes without their,
Mm.
knowledge or informed consent. So 81% of people got this correct, and only 17% answered the one of the other distractors, which said it was predominantly drugs, sex, and pleasures, which you were kind of mentioning with the Manson family with the
Mm.
LSD, which that can be a component of it, but actually, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in most thought reform environments that they don't really use drugs at all. I mean, it's mostly just um, deception, and
Yeah, absolutely.
so
In Scientology, no, street drugs are considered wrong, and you won't be allowed to do Scientology if you revert to drugs. So I don't, it's interesting with the legalization of cannabis and decriminalization in so many places. Their rule is still cannabis is evil, even though Hubbard, in fact, in his first book, said it was probably the safest of all the drugs. But yeah, there are certain contradictions in this teaching. But yeah, and the Mormons are well known, of course, for they abstain from alcohol and coffee and tobacco as well. I guess there have been groups that have, taken on peyote, for example, as a sacrament in imitation of certain Native American people, and you've got shamanistic uses of Amanita muscaria. But yeah, for the most part, I think what Hubbard realized was that if people took hallucinogens, particularly, they might see things from a different point of view. They might have a sudden conversion experience and leave Scientology. I think that may have had something to do with it. And I am confident that he himself took LSD, even though it was forbidden. I have two sources. One, a person he told he'd taken LSD, and the other, somebody who had whose guru had taken it with Ron Hubbard back in the early 50s. And certainly he admitted to taking barbiturates, he admitted to taking amphetamines in large quantities. He was a heavy drinker. But yeah, the followers, drugs are not necessarily useful. The idea of the hashishan, the assassins, the old man of the mountains and all of that, getting people really stoned so they could go and kill people. Well, no, they're not going to do that, are they? They're going to sit there looking at the knife going, oh, wonder what this is for, It's not not a good way. If you That's a tip for anybody that's wanting to train as a ninja. Don't get stoned first.
all right. So, and then the other distractors for that question were barely selected at all. So I'm going to move on to the next one.
Hmm?
So this question was interesting. It was like asking about it was describing like which answer describes all leaders of psychologically manipulative groups.
Hmm.
So the four potential answers were that all psychologically manipulative group leaders are abusive people who have learned manipulation techniques, which was the correct answer.
Hmm.
The next one was intelligent people with compelling ideologies. Third distractor was highly charismatic people, or the fourth one was ambitious people who start secret societies. So I thought it was going to be 80+% that answered correctly, but it was only 42% that correctly answered that they're abusive people. So, and
That
of
is
course,
interesting.
abusive people, of course, means, people with, the types of personality disorders that we see among cult leaders. So,
Hmm.
narcissism, psychopathy, antisocial personality disorder,
The
malignant
dark
narcissism.
triad.
Yep. Uh, so, uh, so yeah, so only 42% people got that correct. Now there was almost an even split among the false answers of 30% going for the intelligent people with compelling ideologies, or 27% with highly charismatic. So I think this question really illustrates that like a lot of kind of the lay understanding of psychologically manipulative groups, like the leaders, is that kind of like the Jim Jones type figure,
Hmm.
right? Like highly charismatic, and then they uh, I guess like with the compelling ideologies, like because you can be an intelligent person with a compelling ideology that's not, like whether you're
Hmm.
abusive or not is really the definitive factor of whether it's going to be a harmful group or not. So
Yeah, to a very large
yeah,
extent. Yeah.
yeah. So that question was quite interesting and one of the more difficult questions on the entire test. Okay, so this one. this next question is how many humans in the world are currently being psychologically manipulated? So this was an order of magnitude answer. So the possible responses were 0 people, which the two thought reform deniers in the sample went for. So two responses for that one.
Bless them.
Thousands, but less than a million. So that would be exceedingly rare. So 10% of the sample responded thousands, but less than a
Mm,
million. Now the next two were interesting. So 49% it was millions, but less than a billion. And then 32% said that it was a billion people or more.
mm.
So for this one, it was interesting because it was hard to find like a good quantitative statistic to cite to back up like what's the correct answer for this, right? But I mean, with conversations with you, we kind of just determined that it's probably a billion people or more because you have to take
Oh
into
yeah.
account all the different social contexts and the totalitarian regimes, right? So you
Mm,
have to count all the people that are currently being affected by thought reform
mm,
in, Russia, China, North Korea,
mm,
and all the other, just all the dozens of social contexts that this paradigm of influence occurs in.
mm.
Uh, so that's why we selected a billion people or more as the correct answer. So,
Yeah. I
but I
mean,
mean, I'd say, if someone responded a billion or millions, but less than a billion, I think they still have a good, um, that's still more hopeful than the people who think it's more, exceedingly rare. So,
yeah. I mean, you can fool all of the people some of the time. That um, I, I think that there's a kind of spectrum of the degree of influence, and I think you started with a statement that was on the Open Minds website about it being 10% of people or something. And that did originate with me. I was asked by the guy who put it on the site what I guessed it was. And that's all it was. It was a guess. At least 10% of people are actually under authoritarian influence. Now, I would suggest that in fact the number is closer to 60% rather than 10% of the entire world's population because of the degrees of influence and because of authoritarianism as a concept in terms of cognitive biases, the idea that, daddy knows best, the idea that somebody who stood up and said, I know the truth, I know the way, just follow me, you'll be fine. And, you end up with World War II as the consequence of this kind of certainty from this particular personality type. And, I am at the moment, I'm talking to a friend who's a psychologist about some kind of scale of authoritarian personality and to look at it as a disorder, as, that's something where people don't feel able to make decisions or feel charismatically drawn to an authoritarian dom. That's I've decided that we're going to get real about this. We're going to have doms and subs, I thought. So we'll have authoritarians who believe they are the gift of God or indeed God incarnate, and authoritarians who are subservient to them. And I'm back to Donald Trump, but that's all I'm talking about the last few weeks. He has said that human beings are either predators or prey, which is just the most odious idea. I am not a predator and I am not prey. That's not my way of looking at humanity. But I think that is the authoritarian way of looking at humanity. And people look at, well, if the Fuhrer said it, then it must be true. That they, and I think that is part of a society that is authoritarian, that our educational system is authoritarian. It's not. It's most certainly not democratic, and nor should it necessarily be democratic. You don't want 5-year-olds voting on what they ought to learn, but it should be progressively. By the time you're 18, you should come out with an understanding of what democracy is, and hopefully a willingness to support it, rather than joining the Ku Klux Klan or, the Nation of Islam or any sort of extremist group. I think, unfortunately, we've completely let our children down in this respect. Not my children. My children have they've heard about this over the years, but it it is an interesting situation that so how many people are influenced by authoritarians? How many people are well, that's the population of North Korea. I think China, you'd find it's slightly less. That there might be 10 or 20% of Chinese people who've got a really good handle on this, and the same in Russia. But in the US, There might be 40% of people who are not under authoritarian control, but there are probably 60% who are, whether they are Democrats or Republicans. And I'd like to point out that I've said horrible things about just about every Democrat president as well as every Republican president. I like Jimmy Carter, but I think his foreign policy was awful. So it's not a matter of bias on my part. You, as Groucho Marx said, whatever it is, I'm against it. You know.
Yeah, and there's a good research study too, because a detailed quantitative estimate of thought reform victimization, looking at all the different contexts and having and a lot of it's going to be part of how you define it too. Like you were saying,
Oh yeah.
What's the cutoff point of counting someone in that? Because of course the intensity is going to depend on each person's experience. Uh, so I just wanted to. It's great that we kind of gave more context in terms of we just don't know,
No,
right? That yeah, what
exactly.
the exact uh extent of thought
Too
reform
many.
victimization.
Too
Yeah,
many.
yeah. We can agree that it's too many, but yeah, we need more quantitative
Mm,
research. Is what I would call for.
mm.
Okay, so this next question on the survey was one of my favorites. So it was talk about legal protections in America. So, it was asking respondents what legal protections exist against psychological manipulation in America. And the majority of people, so 65% of the sample, said that there are almost no legal protections, which is the correct answer.
Yeah.
And I just thought this was hilarious in a way,
Mm.
because it's kind of like, oh yeah, psychological manipulation, it's a problem, but our legislators aren't doing anything about it. They don't care. So that's kind of, and I was surprised that it was this high, actually.
Yeah.
I would assume that most lay people would just kind of think, oh yeah, of course, manipulating someone's against the law. So, but
Mm.
it's not, and a lot of majority of people understood that. So the other distractors for that one were that it's a federal crime. So 7% of people thought it was a federal crime. 12% thought that it was a state crime in some states, and then 4% said it was a state crime in all 50 states. And those were pretty low percentages for all those. And then the
Mm.
remainder was non-response for this one. So I was very impressed with this one as well, that
Yeah.
the majority of South Dakota adults understood that they're pretty much on their own. That the kind of the legal the legal system is not protecting them against
Mm.
psychological manipulation. Okay, so I have one more survey question that I want to highlight, and again,
Mm.
there was a lot more that I'm not covering here, uh, but this was the hardest question on the entire test, and this was asking respondents which type of person is most commonly recruited into a psychologically manipulative group. So the four distractors were people of low intelligence. The second one was normal and ordinary people. The third one was the needy and dependent, and the fourth one was mentally unstable. And then there was a option people could select for manipulation doesn't exist, which was the two thought reform deniers that selected that one. And then 9% of people were non-response. So
Mm.
only 27% of people answered this one correctly, that it's normal and ordinary people that are predominantly recruited into psychologically manipulative groups. And over 50%, so 57% of people said it was the needy and dependent. So, and we know why this is a common misconception, because people who have been indoctrinated into a psychological manipulative group will be needy and dependent, but it's
Mm.
because they became predominantly it's because they became that way
Yeah.
as a result of the thought reform program, and not because they were needy and dependent at the start. So
Yeah. I mean, I had a real surprise many years ago. I was fielding phone calls from this woman who was quite evidently severely alcoholic, and I felt sorry for her, and I'd sit and talk with her for an hour or so now and then. And I brought her name up to somebody who had known her. And she said, oh, yeah, when she got in Scientology, she was running a very successful business and her life was great. And Scientology then wrecked her. And I've now come across, so many victims of that. So it's what you say. Um, my friend Yuval Laor, I think very rightly says that joining a cult is like walking in dog mess. That's it. It's not because there was something wrong with you. It's not because there was a special weakness. You were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And of course, people often think that the vulnerability is a weakness, but the vulnerability can actually be a strength. It can be if you're a very friendly and outgoing person. and you get in with the Moonies, and go for a 3 day thing with them. It can be because you've just got a great new job, and some of the people you're working with, you find out are members of Soccer Gakkai or what have you. Um, it Vulnerability is more usually a change in your life, a change in your routine. So moving from one place to another, getting a relationship ending or a relationship beginning, but a transformation of some kind, which is why, to some extent, teenagers who are going to college and old people like myself who have retired are the two most vulnerable groups. I think with teenagers also that you have your infatuation glands start working, and that you're more uh, drawn to things. Um, in studying terrorism, and I've written about terrorism. It's a book, Lone Actor Terrorism, behind me, Oxford University Press, and Steve Hassan and I did a piece on lone actor terrorism. And I've started reading about terrorism in the early 90s and kind of go, oh, yeah, the same sort of things are happening here. If you look at Baader-Meinhof, the Red Brigades, Sendero Luminoso, the IRA, the same kind of fanaticism and fervor that you see in pseudo-religious groups, in some of the commercial cults, some of the MLMs, that it's that rousing of fervor, that people can then be directed and used as weapons. And the great expert on terrorism, or one of the few true experts, is Ariel Marari, at Tel Aviv and I think Yale. And where a lot of people have commented from their understanding of psychology, he actually interviewed hundreds of people who'd been involved. And Speckart and Kapta Akhmedova also actually did interviews with people who were failed suicide bombers and Marari did, where the general thought is that terrorists are normal people, that there is no significant difference when you start looking at cults. And again, you have to generalize so horribly to do this. The idea is that 2 years of college education is a kind of average you'll find among recruits into European and American terrorist groups, and cult members, people who've joined religious therapy or commercial cults. And Marari challenges this and says, actually, when you look to terrorist groups, and of course he's looking at Al-Aqsa, the PLO, the various Hamas, that there is a higher proportion of people with a dependent personality disorder. But even there, that higher proportion doesn't take you past 10% of the membership. It's higher than the proportion in the normal society. And of course, people who have that terrible condition will be more easily led. But when I was in Scientology, I knew in this country 8 medical doctors who were involved, a NASA physicist, PhD physicist, a couple of dentists. So I knew 6 Oxford graduates. It was not about, as you found in the survey, the demographic is not especially relevant, that people from all walks of society. You'll find groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, who will tend to have a much lower educational attainment because the group frowns upon this, because, heck, Jesus is coming in the next 10 minutes. And so it's a waste of time getting an education, which they've been saying. I think the first prediction was somewhere around 1880 or something, that the world was going to end, but never mind. So, different groups will have a slightly different shape in terms of personality, but yeah, it's just everyday people. There's also, then you look at the other way, Margaret Singer, when she was working on Cults in Our Midst with Janja Lalich, which is an exceptional book. I had a conversation with her and she said, well, I've called it Cults in Our Midst, and I think it says in the book somewhere, because we are in the midst of cults, that our society is interlocking nests of cultic belief. And that when you start looking, it's just a matter of how extreme those beliefs are. But as you say, we have cognitive biases, and they come from the culture in which we live, which has all sorts of, cognitive biases and bizarre ideas. And we accept things, say, as traditions that are very modern. So, say, the Christmas tree, which Prince Albert brought from Germany to the court of Queen Victoria in the around about 1840 or something, and now it's always been with us. Or the image of Santa Claus, on the same theme. The guy in all of the red and white stuff, well, that's from a Coca-Cola poster from the 1930s, and the first version of it anybody's found was, I think, at the very end of the American Civil War. In other countries, he dresses in other colors, and so on and so forth. We very rapidly absorb something as the way that we ought to do it, the way that it is done, and the way that it has always been done. And every generation, in fact, changes these cliches of society. Let's call them memes. I don't like that word because of its origins, which is pseudoscientific. But they become tropes. They become, the way people think about things. So that when you say, look, if you're an Arab country, don't take your shoe off and wave it about. It won't be popular. If you're in Thailand, don't show the soles of your feet to people. If you're in this country, don't do that to people. It doesn't mean V for victory, as Winston Churchill tried to convince us. It means I've still got my fingers, and comes from the longbowmen who were fighting against the French in the 14th and 15th centuries. When the French caught the English longbowmen, they cut those fingers off. And so, but that's what it means. It means I've still got my fingers, and it has come to mean something rather rude. But so from one culture to the next, you've got all of these things, and we respond to them almost automatically. And in my lifetime, we have moved from the N word being sadly acceptable to being properly unacceptable, and then becoming culturally confused by young people in the Black community and indeed the Latino community wanting to adopt the word to describe themselves, in the same way that Blacks adopted the word man because they were tired of being called boy. And so the hippies call everybody man with no understanding of why they're using this word. But those changes in language and changes in culture, when I was a kid, the F word was not to be spoken. Now the F word is commonplace. It's even on television. Who'd have thought it? And is seen as simply a way of amplifying an idea. It's like going very, very, or, I'm really annoyed, or what have you. Whereas I know that about 30 years ago, there was a study done, and it was found that about 50% of people actually had a neurological response to swearing. That it was like they immediately, like, you've used a word that's, and yet these words come and go, they move around, they change their influence. And we find ourselves swimming in this cultural sea where, we are no longer going to talk about red Indians, that's for sure, And yet when I watch historians who are themselves Native American, am I allowed to say Native American still? Who are themselves Native American, they refer to themselves as Indians. Oh dear. Or the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People, where coloured is, those things have, created an extremist woke community at one end, where people are being irrational in certain ways, and an extremist anti-woke culture at the other end, who are being extremely irrational. And that moves from, a lot of that, I think, is the fervor, is the emotional conviction that people have. And again, Yuval Noah has done a lot of work on this, and his book should be available next year, I hope, because I think it's a very relevant issue as to how emotionally convinced we are, how emotionally attached we are to certain ideas. Yes, I have interposed. Forgive me.
No, it's okay. That was the last question that I wanted to highlight.
Mm.
One other thing I wanted to talk about, and I guess a lot of people might not understand this unless they formally studied cybersecurity, but privacy is actually it's a sister discipline to
Mm.
security. So privacy and security are not the same things. And if we're talking about, like why did a cybersecurity PhD such as myself, end up studying thought reform, and a
Mm.
lot of it has to do with its connection with privacy, actually. So, just to give I mean, privacy is actually very difficult to define, but I actually like Daniel Salab's, he provided a kind of a terse definition that it's relief from harmful types of social friction. And of course, we have academic models for what those
Mm.
types of harmful types of social friction are. So there's 16 different types of privacy harms, and one of them is decisional interference. So this is taking away someone's autonomy.
Yeah.
That's what thought reform is all about. But it goes beyond that though, because there's 15 more privacy harms. So surveillance and interrogation. So passively or actively getting information from someone. Sounds familiar in cultic milieus.
Mm.
Blackmail is a privacy harm. So that's used as a tool for control. And I mean, I could keep going, but so you see all these different privacy harms in the way
Mm.
that, privacy uh, is compromised, and really that's part and parcel to the functioning of a thought reform environment. So I just wanted to highlight that I really saw connections with the privacy field. Um, so
Yeah.
that was definitely part of why I think cybersecurity and privacy professionals are uniquely positioned to do research in this area,
Mm.
because it is a privacy issue.
Mm. I think that's a very important insight. Um, I about 10 years ago, I published a piece called Little Sister is Listening to You because of the rise of devices like Cortana, Siri, Alexa. Um, and the first case, which was, I think, about 10 years ago, where the FBI had tried to demand recordings actually of a murder, and they managed to get them. And you're in this situation where you're going, if you have one of these devices in your house, then everything it hears is being recorded. Oh dear, what would George Orwell say about that? And it interests me. I had a long conversation with somebody who'd been a university professor who was like, yeah, but it's so convenient. And you kind of go, yeah, there's a slippery slope.
Yeah.
I don't have to look after my children, and okay, I lose a few of them to the robot because it eats them, but, it's convenient, you know. I get to play bingo and go to the shopping mall. So, I get a life. Okay.
Yeah,
Um,
it gets very complicated trying to defend one's own personal privacy.
mm,
And I mean, I've used different tools and stuff, but really when you dig deep and the practice is called personal privacy. So that'd be
mm,
like not at the organizational level, but at the personal level of managing privacy risk. It's almost impossible to have like a very strong degree of privacy in our
mm,
modern day society just because of digital technology, and it would almost be a full-time job, and it costs a lot of money to like scrub yourself from all the data brokers, not having your name tied to your address, which is a physical safety concern for many different people,
mm,
especially vulnerable populations. So uh, it's quite interesting to think that privacy is more and more becoming a privilege, although it should be a human right, if
mm,
you want my opinion. Uh, so it so that connection with thought reform, and also too privacy. The more privacy you have, the less vulnerable you'll be to thought reform recruitment. And part of the reason why is that cult leaders will use personal information to tailor the recruitment.
mm.
So of course, one of the examples I cite in the dissertation is targeting grieving widows and widowers, which I think that was the Lyndon LaRoche movement, if I'm
Yeah,
remembering correctly.
the Ruches, yeah.
Yeah.
The- the-
So obviously the more like medical conditions, if you're going through vulnerable parts of your life, yeah, like if you are grieving over the death of a loved one, then sadly there are people who will exploit that,
mhm,
those vulnerabilities. So the less of a footprint that you have online, the less likely that the influence will be targeted to you specifically. So there's just an interesting connection there with privacy,
mm,
where it's protective.
mm. With Cambridge Analytica, Brittany Kaiser says that by the time of the 2016 election, They had 5,000 data points or pieces of information on every adult in the United States. And she explained that you don't have to be on Facebook or Meta or what have you. You don't have to be on Twitter or X. You don't have to be on any platform at all. If somebody talks about you, then, and I don't think people realize quite how thorough information gathering is. My first experience of it was back in 1986, and somebody I knew had a mini computer, not a microcomputer, the kind that we use now, but the next. And he showed me he put all of or most of Scientology's voluminous literature onto this machine, and in a matter of then 9 seconds, it could be searched completely. Now, the point came home to me very immediately. If you therefore get into what's happening in security systems, look at something like the Echelon system, phone system that was used in this country in collaboration with American intelligence, so that every phone conversation, every landline conversation when Echelon was started was going through this place, and keywords could be selected. And you now get to the point where it's like, well, is anything secure? People just don't understand that you can record a lifetime of conversations and search it in half a second for keywords, and it will pull that information out. So it gets ever more sophisticated. And, at worst, you get something like the Chinese state, where everybody has a social credit that comes from the analysis that's going on all the time of everything they do on camera or through their phone. And their privileges can be restricted in consequence. If they jaywalk, which in this country is not considered a serious offense, I think it's more seriously considered in the US because you might get shot. But in China, oh, no jaywalking. You've got to wait till the little man turns green before you cross the road. And that will take a point off your social credit rating if you're found crossing the street, even though there's no traffic. You're crossing the street and the little man hasn't said you can do it. And that authoritarianism and again, looking at indices for authoritarianism, we are seeing in international surveys that authoritarianism, populism is very definitely on the rise. And, you may well be suffering the consequences of that in a few days in America. But this idea of giving control to what? To some perception of a hero in your head that Franco or Mussolini or Gaddafi or whoever represents somehow a paternal figure who will protect you. I think that's the simple psychology of it, rather than going, yeah, I've got to be my own parent. I'm a grown-up. I've got to think about things and make decisions. And I've got to keep an open mind. I've got to be willing to understand that I have blind spots, lacunae, as the psychologists call them. There are things that, Steve Hassan, as when I first met him back in the 80s, long ago, he was sort of, well, how would you know if you'd been brainwashed? This wonderful question. How would you know if it had happened to you? How would you know? And the answer is, well, you wouldn't. It would be effective. And you would go along with those thoughts. And having dealt now with well over 1,000 Scientologists, about 600 in their recovery, and hundreds of people from other groups, there it is that you're dealing with intelligent, capable, competent people who have, had their thought stream moved so that their internal reality control has been given over to somebody else. And you then, in going to Lifton's brilliant 8 points, you get ideology over experience, doctrine over person. This point where somebody says, and I have seen this frequently, where somebody has an experience in life, they have actually witnessed something, and the group says, no, that isn't true. So in Scientology, you have what's called the truth rundown, something that came about long after I left, where if somebody disagrees with David Miscavige, who leads the group, then they're sat down and basically electrodes with a meter to check their responses until they ultimately say that what they saw with their own eyes didn't happen. And they come to believe that, which is toward the beginning of our conversation, talked about false memory induction. And it is the simplest thing in the world to get somebody to believe something that didn't happen, or to overwrite, as it were, in computing terms, their own experience. And teaching people how to be resistant to that, I think your work will help greatly in pointing in that direction, saying this is something we really need to be concerned about, and we really do need laws that protect us from the manipulations which are rife in our society. Whether it's the simple techniques that are used by advertisers, or the more extreme techniques that are used by propagandists, by spin doctors, who sadly seeped all the way into the political field. I'm sure that part of our distrust now of politics is that so many spin doctors have gone public and said, this is how we conned you. It's like, okay, great.
Yeah, and speaking about like thinking about it from the viewpoint of a security professional, we like to think in terms of like security controls or privacy controls. So, and this has a very specific definition. So, a security or privacy control it's a technology or technique you put in place to reduce risk. So, we need security and privacy controls to reduce thought reform risk. So, of course, education and awareness is one of, if not the most important family of controls that we can put in place to reduce the harms and the likelihood of thought reform abuses in society. But it's not only education and awareness. In my lit review, I mentioned many other things. Again, practicing assertiveness. I just mentioned privacy, of course, critical thinking. There's a lot of different things that we can do at the individual and societal level to reduce risk. So this isn't just, I guess what I'm trying to say is we need a whole culture of security, a whole culture of mind security, psychological security, and privacy.
Yeah, freedom of mind, as Steve
Right.
puts it.
Yeah, self-determination and autonomy. And again, this ties back to the privacy thing with decisional interference. Do we want other people to take away our free will and impose their will on us, or do we want to be individuals, with that deserve dignity and respect and have human rights, not just in theory but in practice, in our societies? And so, those security controls, like my dissertation focused just on the education awareness side. But what I'm trying to say is we'll need a whole collection of security controls. We'll need frameworks for defending the mind. How do we defend against memory manipulation? How do we defend against all the different subtypes or instances of thought reform and scams? So this is really a wide open research area. I think there's a lot of theoretical and practical work that needs to be done to formalize psychological security as a discipline.
Yeah, I think so, and I think the will towards this seems to have changed. That in the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s, you had Solomon Asch, Stanley Milgram, the recently demised Philip Zimbardo, the great Philip Zimbardo, remarkable man, Prakhar Aronson, a whole raft of people who were doing experimental work to try and understand why we are so susceptible. I mean, very much on the heels of Hannah Arendt, and trying to understand how it was that the German-speaking population, and let me underline the word speaking there, the German-speaking population had followed this terrible, stupid, unscientific idea and brought catastrophe. 50 million lives are lost as a consequence of beliefs being adopted. So how was it that so many people could become convinced of this? Why was there so little resistance to the Nazis? Outside of, say, the White Rose, which is a tiny little organization, there's very little resistance. And you realize that the sheer brutality with which they met their opponents, that after the Reichstag fire, within 1 month of coming to power, Adolf Hitler has put all of his political opponents into camps. which of course is being suggested under the Sedition Act by Donald Trump at the moment. And people are still going, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. You're going to go, what is it you want? How do you want to live? And it's like, well, he does have a beautiful body, as he has told us. And look at those dance moves to Ave Maria. I mean, it's become self-satire. And I could walk down Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and nobody would care. It's become that shocking, that horrible. But that is where we live, and it's where we've been brought to by not having sufficient education and awareness, and by tools being developed by the likes of Mark Zuckerberg and his coterie to reduce us to a kind of adolescent fandom population instead of, stalker fans, stans. Instead of, my friend Arachelev's work on intelligent disobedience, on courageous swallowership, these very important concepts that he's pushed into the society, and some view of sane and profitable human society, where our humanity is important rather than our ethnicity, where we can be judged by the content of our character, as a famous man once said. Studying some of the, what used to be branded as the alt-right, we wrote about Dylan Roof in the Lone Act of Terrorism, and reading his manifesto, The Last Rhodesian, it's just like the ignorance, but the transformation that happens, because he's saying he went to school with black kids and everything was fine, that he has no problems with what happened. And it was only when Trayvon Martin was shot that he became aware. And he started reading right-wing sites. And when I was researching this chapter, I was really shocked when I went on to some of the white supremacist, white nationalist sites at the hate, at the language that was being used. And of course, having to understand that, people like Richard Spencer, they're not stupid. And they do believe what they're saying, but garbage in, garbage out, in the old computing terms. If you start believing that Fred Leuchter's statements about Auschwitz are correct, if you don't realize that Auschwitz was actually razed to the ground by the Russians and rebuilt, so that the gas chamber that he tested for cyanide residue, those bricks weren't necessarily in the gas chamber, and cyanide, of course, is given off into the atmosphere very quickly. And he was not scientifically qualified to be doing any of what he did and had no permissions. I don't really mind that last part. But people will believe something because, critical thinking, extremely important, but understanding our and being able to assert ourselves, as you say, extremely important. But without an understanding of our emotional attachment to things, Jill Bolte Taylor, who was a Harvard neuroscientist who had a stroke and recovered and wrote a wonderful book about it. But she points out that we have this conception that we are thinking creatures with feelings. But the truth is, as a neuroscientist, we are feeling creatures that think. I also would say you can't really differentiate thought and emotion. It's a made-up differentiation. But we don't realize the extent of our own subjectivity and how we can be manipulated by somebody reaching into that and emotionally stimulating us. William Sargent in Battle for the Mind, one of the earliest books trying to understand this problem in the 50s, wrote a chapter about John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, and how people would go to a Methody meeting and he would say, well, we're going to go to hell and this is what's going to happen to you, or you're going to get to heaven. It's really going to be nice. And as you're walking home this evening, you could be struck dead. So, and a guy starts walking from the back of the room to call him a charlatan. It's like, how dare you do this? And then he spins round and falls to the ground, which is the normal Methody trance of the time. That's because powerful emotion is manipulable. And most people don't realize that hating something or being infatuated with something are aspects of the same process in the brain, that high stimulation in the brain emotionally. It doesn't matter whether it's distress, fear, whatever it is. When you're highly stimulated, you actually do become very highly manipulable if there's somebody who knows how to do that, who knows. So somebody can enrage you and then control you through your rage. So I think it is vital to have an understanding of how emotional or not we are. We also have people who have varieties of autism on the spectrum in different places who are brilliant at certain jobs because they don't get emotional, so they make extraordinarily good scientists, surgeons, in some cases artists, because they can focus in a different way. But you do want a mix of different temperaments, I think, in all situations, because otherwise there'll be an emotional bias towards a particular kind of temperament, and they will start excluding other people. It's like the term neurodiverse. It's like I haven't met anybody who wasn't neurodiverse yet. What's the typical? Where is this person? But that we can then start excluding other people from our group and make ourselves a minority. And as my next door neighbour's handyman said when we were talking the other year, he said, "I'm in a minority of one." And it's like, yes, me too, absolutely. And so understanding how we are separated out into othering people and saying they are them, they're different, as I've been doing to Trump supporters for the last few weeks, I suppose. But there you go. There are pitfalls in all of this.
Yeah, and that's another interesting line of research too, is kind of the diversity of human experience and neurodiversity. Actually, one thing that your audience will probably find interesting, a relatively new strand of research is into aphantasia. So this is the condition of not having or your mind's eye is blind. So people who are not able to voluntarily produce visual imagery. So it would just be interesting to see, like,
How do you sorry? How do you spell that? Aphantasia.
Aphant Asia.
Asia. Good.
And then
That's
kind of
how
a
I spell
corollary
it.
to this is anaurelia, which is the people who don't have inner monologues.
Yeah.
So the reason why I bring this up is that maybe perhaps like for the subject of hypnosis, for example. So hypnosis, I mean, I'm not an expert in hypnosis, but a lot of what I've heard about it is that it's manipulating or guiding someone's imagination. So kind of the visual images that the person has. But what about a person who has aphantasia who doesn't have visual images? Are they resistant to hypnosis, or does it still work in some circumstances? So these are all things in the kind of this
Hmm.
talking about psychological security, because that would be interesting to know. Are some people more naturally resistant to certain forms of influence?
Hmm.
I don't like to use the word immune, but
Nobody's immune.
but again, maybe there's a heightened resistance
Hmm.
towards certain types. Just food for thought.
Yeah. I mean, one of the traditional thoughts, and I'm going to pick up the word hypnosis here. Um, it Hypnosis has come to be used to mean hypnotism, and it actually means the state that is induced by hypnotism. I want to bring it back to its traditional meaning. So hypnosis is a state which some people call trance. I don't like that word. Or an altered state. And I'm going, well, altered from what? What's the base state that's the proper state for us to be in? We have different states of mind. During hypnosis, we are responsive. As you say, it's a guided imagination. Somebody who doesn't have visual imagery will presumably still have memories. And it's a matter of how, I mean, I know that my mind is more linguistic than visual, even though I'm a painter by trade. I, have networks of words, and I will work between them and sometimes fall into a kind of James Joycean well of puns. But you will find the system with which that person functions. It's long been said, however, in the field of hypnotism, for 50 or more years, that people who are phlegmatic are the one type of people, they're one end, and the other end is psychopaths. There are these two types of people that you cannot put into a hypnotic state. So the psychopath because they're utterly resistant to any external influence. So it is thought. This is all hypothetical, of course. And the phlegmatic because they have no emotional effect. They don't respond emotionally. And there's the key to what's happening in hypnotism, that you are creating an emotional response to an imaginary situation. So to think about it in as it applies to populations, the idea that was put forward by the Nazis that Jews carry lice and that the lice carry diseases, and that this physiological feeling, this aversion, could be roused in a population. Who would believe this abject nonsense? But so you start getting physical feelings that are roused. I was talking to my friend Jeremy Sherman the other week, and I said voting for somebody through my lifetime has been the lesser of two evils, and he says it makes my skin crawl when somebody says lesser of two evils. And I went, oh, that's interesting. You do get that makes you controllable. That there are things that cause you disgust, phobia, or guilt. These are the three places where manipulation happens. It's not happening on an intellectual level generally. It's happening, by getting into how we feel about things.
Yeah, putting anyone into any kind of heightened emotional state. So kind of circling back around to the romance scams that we were talking about earlier, those aren't based on, I mean, there is a fear component, but they're not based on the negative emotions predominantly. You're leveraging someone's capacity to love another human being
Mm.
to scam them. So it can be positive emotions as well. Just any
Abs-
heightened emotional state
yeah.
reduces your critical thinking capacities and makes you vulnerable. And we're all human. We all have our moments of that heightened emotional vulnerability, but that's why the education awareness is so crucial, because if you are targeted in that moment, you don't stand a fighting chance without a basic understanding of what could happen.
Yeah, don't think twice. Don't sign any contract before taking it away. Talk to your friends. Look on the internet. Check things out, and be aware of your own limerence. That's what psychologists call infatuation. When we first met in 2015, he came to a conference I gave in Toronto, and he had this amazing model already figured out, which had been his PhD, the religious ape. And I looked at this, and he'd got, the parent to child, the relation of the teenager to the parent as different from the child, sibling relationships, the doctrine as the baby, which was a brilliant thought, that he's saying if you criticize the belief system somebody has, it's like saying their baby is ugly. It's like, well, you're not allowed to do that. And I looked at it, I went, infatuation. Where's infatuation in this model? And he went off and became very expert and came back and said, it's called limerence. I think that's probably the greatest driver. The need for a story. We love stories. And our limerence, our infatuation, the need for novelty, the need to, that great feeling of being high, that Disney movies so desperately try to make us. Oh. And we're suckers for it. We love it. And, if you go off to one side into the work of David Maurer, who was a linguist who became friends with a lot of con men because he was fascinated by their language. What's a cackle bladder? So in a con where somebody suddenly is bleeding, it's because they've got a cackle bladder, which is a hen's bladder that's been filled with red ink, and you can burst it. Oh, I've been shot. But he loved these terms, and he got to know these people very well over a couple of decades, and wrote, I think it's called The Big Con or something, Mauer, Mauer, this amazing book which lays out the different cons and how they work. And it's all about attaching an emotional significance to something, making somebody feel rushed. They've got to do something. The movie The Sting comes from a con that's called The Wire, which Mauer describes. And so understanding these things, I'm all for watching, films like Nine Queens, brilliant Argentinian film, that show you how it works, how it's done, how you get somebody to, basically invest themselves in the scam. And what Mao was told by some very, significant con artists was that a lot of people come back to be conned again because they think the guy that recruited them, that brought them in, is the guy that conned them. Whereas the guy that actually conned them is the guy they're coming back to and saying, well, the $30,000 I lost on your previous scheme, I'd like to put some money in your next one. And they'll come back again after that, based on the idea that rich people think they're rich because they're clever. I could never be fooled. Yeah, really. There we go. I read this week about somebody who she's given $360 million to Scientology. What hope is there for the world? It's like with people out there who are willing to contribute so much. But there you go. It's is there anything that because I know just how worked out everything is for you. You are brilliant. That when you're doing a dissertation, there was the presentation. It was all. So, have you got anything else on your list for today?
Actually, yeah, one more thing.
Mm,
My wife and I watch a lot of cult documentaries.
mm,
It's actually kind of unusual because I would like when I was first reading the literature on thought reform, I hadn't seen that many cult documentaries. I
mm,
would come across people a lot or that had seen many more than I had.
mm.
And actually, I'm glad that I started with the literature rather than cult documentaries because cult documentaries are pretty bad overall at actually explaining how the thought reform works.
Yeah.
In fact, most of them are quite lousy at it.
Mm,
So yeah, if there's any documentarians watching, you want to make sure that, and you don't have to get, super formal about it. You just have to humanize it, show how can a person be taken through a deceptive series, the thought reform program to become a different, person and have their
mm,
autonomy compromised. So I want to recommend kind of the best kind of in terms of thought reform education. There's different ways you could rate documentaries like based on how interesting they are, but I
mm,
think the two masterpieces really are Seduced inside the Nexium
mm.
cult. So that's perhaps the best cult documentary ever made in terms of educating the public about
And
how
you can
thought reform
see
actually works.
Hoyt Richards, who was the consultant to that, has frequently appeared on this channel. So he'll be very
Yeah.
pleased that you like that.
Yeah.
He does have
So,
another documentary coming out. So,
ooh, okay. Yeah, and the second one that I'd recommend is actually a more recent one about the troubled teen industry called The Program, Cults, Cons, and Kidnappings.
oh, I haven't seen that.
So yeah, so and that again, I think it was released just half a year ago, right? I think it was March 2024. So that's another docu-series, and again, they do a great job. And this is a completely different social context too.
Mm,
Showing that in the troubled teen industry doesn't get as much attention, but it has in recent years. I know thought reform scholars have been more interested in it. But this one is another one kind of like Seduced, where they do a very good job of
mm,
humanizing it, explaining how the compromise happens. So those would be my two main cult documentary recommendations in terms of these are the best that I've seen
mm.
in terms of actually educating about protecting people. Because a lot
Yeah.
of cult documentaries are more a good example would be Wild Wild Country. Yeah. It's entertaining. It was very it was
Glossy.
but it had a relatively surface level
Mm,
investigation of, again, humanizing it, actually
mm,
explaining how the thought reform works. So, that's what I would say. Is just because a cult documentary is entertaining doesn't mean it's actually doing good for the person watching it in terms of protecting them
mm.
against this threat. So,
Yeah, I
I just
agree.
wanted to highlight that
Mm,
it's actually very rare to have an effective, documentary that actually brings on a cult expert. Most cult documentaries don't even bring on a cult expert.
mm.
So,
Yeah, absolutely. And when they do, our interviews are cut down to 2 minutes. And
right. Yeah.
the first media interview I did was in March 1984, and it was with the Daily Mail. And I was explaining, as I do, to the journalist, and he just went, no, 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 John, you haven't understood. I want a victim and I want a picture. And every time I've talked to a journalist since, and I've worked on certainly more than 200 pieces, I'm that's in my mind. I want a victim in a picture. So when documentary people come to me, I say, look, there are four things I'm interested in. If you'll hit on any one of them, I'll help you if I can. The first is how are people recruited? The second is why do they stay? The third is how do they leave? And the fourth is how do they recover? And I have that there is something that will come along in the next few months which will explore all of those elements, which I've people I've collaborated with, and I'm very pleased with the work they've done because I share your concern. There have been so many documentaries. There's a documentary called Meet the Mormons, which just follows a missionary, Latter-day Saint teenagers spend 2 years during which they're not allowed to communicate with their family. They're sent away either from one community to another, the Arizona or the Utah communities will exchange people, or they're sent over here or to other outposts. 2 years, teenagers not allowed to communicate with their family. And this documentary just follows one of them without making any comment. And it's really clear what the process is. The other thing I'd recommend is Stolen Youth, about Larry Ray, because you see the process from the beginning, because it's being recorded. You see what he's doing step by step with people. And I would like there to have been a bit more, because you don't realize it's over a 10-year period. It seems to be but he completely takes this small group of students' lives over. What happened to Felicia in that, who was a qualified psychiatrist when she was recruited, is amazing. And her recovery from there is also amazing. I'd also say The Vow, the other Nexium documentary, because there you're seeing footage that was taken inside the cult. So, a lot of the process is there. But it's, again, it's not evaluated properly. One would like to see Steve Hassan or Janja Lalic, or maybe even me, sitting and saying, this is the step here that's just taken place. This is what's happened. When I looked to terrorist recruiting and got Al Qaeda's recruiting manual, my jaw dropped, because these were the same steps that you'll find in Mooney recruitment, in Scientology recruitment. One of the interesting things is you never disagree with the new recruit. Never. You just, everything they think is, and you then love bomb them, you encourage them and get them doing these things. And to see that written cynically in a terrorist recruitment manual and go, oh no, what are we doing? Where are we? So, yeah, this is great. It's been such a pleasure finding out more, rather than having to do bizarre modules so that I'd be qualified.
John's referring to the IRB because anyone
Yeah,
who's involved with the university research in
I had
human
to
subjects
know
has to complete the IRB modules. But
whether information from the Department of Agriculture and Fisheries in the United States could be shared with the Canadians and things like that. I had to do little tests. It was the first time since I was at school, but I did manage to get there just about, and it
well, yeah,
was,
I'm glad you did, because
well,
it was your personal sacrifice, and
no,
that's
it was a privilege to be involved in if only peripherally, in such an important piece of work. And I'd recommend that people, we'll put a link to your dissertation, and we'll let you know when this goes up, which will be fairly soon. We don't keep things in the hopper for long, so that you can look at the comments and, I don't know, make jokes about people or whatever it seems appropriate at the time. I had somebody this week, over the weekend, who said that I should be writing about child marriage in Afghanistan and why am I wasting all this time on Donald Trump. And I was a bit petulant, I'll admit it. I wrote quite a long response, kind of going, here's a list of the things I've written about over the years, which do include mutti marriage. I have commented on mutti marriage, as and female genital mutilation, all sorts of things. But it was that thought, I've spent 40 years researching and writing about these things. Nobody's given me any money for it. This is the Oxford University Press, right? They didn't pay me a cent for the 3 months' work it took to co-write the chapter. And now I've got somebody on YouTube, a free service, who's saying, you should be doing this. And it's like, I've written about 100 things in that time, but so it goes. We do our best. So yeah, please do watch this, make comments, ask questions. Be great to have some questions and to get Dustin back to talk about this, because this is one of the most significant things that's happening how we can protect ourselves from corporations, from the state, from bad actors who want to manipulate us and take us over. And I differ from many people in my field in that I do feel positively. I do feel we have all of the tools to solve these problems. Whether we're going to be smart enough is another matter. But I don't think that the human race is going to collapse in the next 10 years. I think we probably got 15 or 20 years.
I would just say I'm incredibly hopeful too. I mean,
Mm,
it's sobering, reading the literature, and I was sharing my very personal story about how I even got involved with this in the first place.
mm,
Hearing about the human exploitation news, it is traumatizing, it's disturbing, but I mean, I don't have a scientific source for this, but hope is the strongest human emotion. I think
mm,
it's even stronger than love. You can't love without hope,
mm.
and
It's a good point.
we should never give up hope.
Mm,
Even if even if things could get chaotic in the with the election coming up. Even if Donald Trump is elected, we shouldn't give up hope
mm,
that we can maintain our democracy.
mm. Well, it's
There are
survived
yeah,
in one time
I
before.
know, yeah, why won't it?
Yeah.
So I'm hopeful that not that's not an excuse to not be concerned or to do
Mm,
stuff to prevent the bad outcome. But we can't, yeah, we can't ensure the brighter future without hope. So that's the message I wanted to end with.
mm. Yeah, and looking back historically, if we look to Nazi Germany and we look to the carnage and the destruction that much of Germany was leveled to the ground, Germany is, in fairly good condition at the moment. They are having a little bit of rioting and what have you now and then, but economically they're what, the fifth biggest economy in the world or somewhere around there, and they have assimilated people from all over, and they have created a society which has more liberty than the US and more liberty than the UK. So even a country that was so devastated has been able to recover. And
Yeah,
let's hope.
recovery from totalitarianism is possible.
Yeah,
So
yeah, and let's hope that happens everywhere else in the world very soon. Maybe not. But thank you so much, Dustin.
we'll
It's
see.
been
Yeah,
a
yeah,
tremendous
yeah.
pleasure. Thank you.
Yep.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.